The Switch is at end of life, and I think it's time everyone admits that. Many of us already have, not just because it's been almost 7 years, and not just because the Steam Deck has proven itself a moderate threat in several key ways that have opened the space for a cacophony of competitors. Also, not only because we know without any shadow of a doubt now that a successor is well on its way, but also because even Nintendo itself is starting to struggle with releasing content that doesn't struggle, whether it's Legends Arceus, Scarlet and Violet, the lack of overhauls for many of the Mario Kart 8 DLC tracks that came from mobile, etc. Third-party support beyond indies is waning, and has been for a while. Games are more expensive despite being the weakest versions because of the high cartridge costs for developers, and the extra development effort that goes into dialing these games back for such old hardware. This isn't an indictment of the Switch as a whole, although I've said from day one that this was exactly what would happen. And the aging process is quickened to a lightning pace now that the current generation PlayStation, Xbox, and PC hardware are all starting to expect fundamentally different compute workflows, thanks to stark shifts in where hardware bottlenecks lie. The Switch did an admirable job hanging on this long, even though many of the miracle ports like Doom 2016 or The Witcher 3 are very, very rough. Impressive, but rough, and as soon as the Steam Deck released, these ports became entirely redundant to an equally impressive but rough degree. The sparkle of, I can play it on the go, is gone officially now, leaving nothing but a slimmer form factor than the deck, a solid but small lead in ease of use, and the fact that Nintendo games still only come out on Nintendo hardware. And that's if that sparkle was ever there for you to begin with, considering most people I know never let their Switch leave their dock. There have been rough games since the beginning of the Switch's life, more or less. Again, while impressive, Doom 2016, or Wolfenstein, or Witcher 3 can only be called pleasant experiences under very specific circumstances that ignore a lot of mess. And games like Ark came out in the worst state we'd seen for any major release until maybe Cyberpunk on the base PS4 and Xbox One. And from the beginning, I've tried to illustrate why that is. When your hardware is that drastically different from the initial target platform in terms of power, it can be incredibly difficult and expensive to re-engineer it to work on that weaker hardware. When people wanted games like Final Fantasy XV on the Switch back when it was new, and they were upset at Square for not making it happen, I knew why it wasn't gonna happen. When they were furious that Rockstar had no plans to port Red Dead Redemption 2 to the Switch, I rolled my eyes. It's not that ports like that were completely impossible. It was instead that they were extremely improbable, purely because there was one question that was never going to be easy to answer, staring such games in the face. How much compromise to the game's core foundation are you willing to make in order to make it function? And in doing so, how much time and money are you willing to spend hacking and sawing and mutilating that game's corpse until it's playable, but potentially unrecognizable? Is your technology in its current form even suited to doing so, without completely reforming the foundation of the foundation, without completely reworking large parts of the engine to be much more rudimentary in the search for streamlined function? In come the PS5 and the Xbox Series S and X, consoles with solid-state storage solutions that are between 20 and 90 times faster at reading data and putting it into RAM than a Switch cartridge or the SD cards you can use for expanded storage. In come the PS5 and the Xbox Series S and X. Series S offering around 9 times the memory bandwidth of the Switch, and the PS5 and Series X offering 18 times and up to 22 times the memory bandwidth of the Switch, respectively. In come the PS5 and Xbox Series consoles that have dedicated decompression hardware that offloads a wealth of the CPU's work in order to limit throughput bottlenecks as much as possible. These things are not just a loading problem, particularly because while the Switch has much less memory bandwidth than even the basic Xbox One, games also have a much smaller size footprint on the Switch usually, and you simply don't have as much space on the system that needs filled with assets before it's full up and everything's decompressed and ready to go. Anything that's streamed while playing is starting to change though. Not just open world things like new chunks of maps. We're even simply talking about things like how we handle culling out objects that are right off screen and repopulating them when they're about to come on screen. We're talking about having assets ready for any cutscene camera shifts. We're talking about raw level design and other core structures of game design. There are certain design decisions that cannot translate, no matter how hard you try, without spending millions on overhauling the entire game from the ground up. You cannot just translate a game that uses Unreal 5's Nanite for large portions of its geometry pipeline into a game that uses standard level of detail systems, any more than you could turn a game using full path tracing into one that works on a system that can only use traditional baked rasterized lighting techniques. The tools aren't there, the assets aren't there, nothing is there. We're not at these stages yet, but the point is that we are at the precipice of a time where irreversible decisions are being made early in development that only cater to new hardware. You have to think about it this way. Imagine you want to start a company that builds automotive vehicles. You decide you want to make massive semi-trucks. They're big, they're complicated, they require a wealth of different tools, disciplines, engineering workflow and fields, even specific factory layouts in order to be made efficiently. Now imagine you also want to make motorcycles because they're sleek, cheap, efficient, and require far few tools, disciplines, engineering workflows and fields, etc. The problem is, just because a motorcycle is a simpler vehicle does not mean 95% of what you have available to you for making semi-trucks can be used in any way to make a motorcycle. Some aspects will translate. Some aspects will simply be too much, with tools being too large or being unable to work with certain softer metals. Your tire supplier likely won't translate. Your engineering expertise won't translate over. Even your factory layout might be extremely ill-suited to putting together motorcycles, because aside from being wheel-based combustion motor vehicles that use some of the same core components like brakes, exhaust, pistons, and use vaguely similar fuels, there is basically nothing between a motorcycle and a semi-truck that is the same. We have reached a point where game development workflows are changing to new technologies. We're at a point similar to the switch to 3D acceleration. We're at a point not unlike when APIs became more standardized. We're at a point reminiscent of when normal maps and more complex shader pipelines became the standard, not only with ray tracing and different level of detail technologies trying to serve as eventual outright replacements for older techniques across most games, but also with how we store, access, and load assets on a fundamental level. Arc optimization was a mess on basically every platform. The Switch version was just an offensively disgusting low point for that mess. Doom and other id titles were already extremely efficient on every platform, so they had a fighting chance when other games might not have. Witcher 3 has a studio behind it that is allowed to endlessly tweak and upgrade their games for years, barring for launch, so they were given the green light to assist another studio in doing the brutal work of making foundational changes that allowed that port to work. A game like Mortal Kombat 1 on Switch doesn't fit into any of these categories. It likely will never see a previous gen port because, as far as we know, it was designed from the ground up for hardware that's alien to even what the PS4 and Xbox One offer. And as such, the idea of porting it to Switch is ludicrous, particularly when Mortal Kombat 11 already stripped so much of itself away in order to work on the console. It is so rare that developers are to blame for port struggles that I default to saying developers are never really at fault, at least when they have a publisher behind them. You can Actually, at me all you want. But anyone who knows a damned thing about the inner workings of development knows that, well, not every person or every team is the most well-oiled machine. Issues that cause major release problems almost always come from elsewhere. It's not about individuals outside of some select cases where people with a lot of power abuse that power. It's about infrastructure. It's about the money. It's about the shareholders. It's about the business. As such, usually you can blame the publisher when a game releases unfinished, or a port doesn't get the work it deserves. These are just suits. No matter what they tell you, they're money-making bots 95% of the time, especially in publicly traded companies. Volition made a good game in the latest Saints Row. Fuck the people who act like it's trash for clicks without giving it the due it deserves just because the publisher didn't let the developers finish it. If you throw the developers under the bus here for your clicks, you're no better than the suits. Volition didn't deserve to face the core punishment from these launch failures, because I guarantee you every damned developer on that team knew it was an awful idea to release it in that state, just like with Cyberpunk. It was the suits who were looking at the dollar signs and nothing else, who didn't give it enough time in the oven. It was a mess at launch not because it wasn't a great game at its core, because it is, but because the gluttonous pigs were hungry for more food and couldn't wait for it to be cooked all the way through. However, there are also times where this isn't entirely the case. Good business still has to adhere to the core limitations of a capitalist framework, which is especially rough when it's a framework that has been repeatedly twisted to favor bad business more and more. And whether we like it or not, sometimes a project isn't financially viable. If you've ever wondered why certain games don't get remasters, ports, or remakes despite being cult classics that have exploded in recent years, it would sometimes do you well to look at exactly what specifications of that game might be prohibitively expensive to untangle and recraft for different hardware. Sometimes that's licensing. If it costs you too much to relicense something in an old game, or costs you even more to have it removed in relation to how many sales that game is likely to get, it might simply not be worth it. Often, it's about bespoke uses of the original hardware. The PS3 is notorious for this thanks to the cell processor, but it extends far beyond just that console, particularly when the developers get creative and move beyond the intended uses of aspects of the hardware. Other times, it comes down to core foundational differences from modern hardware. Sega Saturn games are already a pain and a half to port thanks to the duo of CPUs that it uses, which is still a very rare and strange quirk specific to that console. But it gets even more complicated when you consider that nearly every three-dimensional console game since then has used either triangle polygons, voxels, or both, and 3D games on the Saturn used quads, or 4-point polygons, instead of 3-point polygons. While this sounds like a simple difference, you have to understand that, as we talked about before, basically every tool, every engine, every bit of 3D game design that has released and been built upon since then has been designed to be as efficient with tries as possible, not quads. We can absolutely blame the insane price, the deceptive trailer, and even the willingness to release Mortal Kombat 1 in such a ridiculously awful state on the Switch on the publisher. All of that is their fault, and I encourage everyone to be angry and make it known that they're angry, without resorting to threats or violence, bullying, etc., and without targeting the developers. But this is a game that no longer realistically has room for the Switch, no matter how basic you make the models, no matter how low resolution you make the textures, no matter how many effects you completely disable, or how low the resolution is. The publisher keeping the price high and using Steam footage in their trailer and releasing the port instead of canceling it after putting all that money into it is damage control for the choices made by the developers along the way. But it's important to recognize that these choices made by the developers were damage control for the brutality of figuring out how to rework the game for such limited, different hardware. Similar to Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart when you try to play the game on a hard drive on PC, this is a game that simply was not made to work with old school engine tech and data structures. It is being forced into conforming to the Switch specs, and short of rebuilding the entire game from the ground up like publishers did for handheld ports of games on the 3DS, DS, or GBA, or Game Boy Color, etc., you are not going to be flattered by whatever it looks like and plays like in the end. You know, I was actually right about the Vita too when it was new. I asserted that making a handheld that played console-level games on the go was a risky choice, because traditionally, handheld systems were where publishers threw all of their lowest risk, cheapest experiences. Didn't mean they were worse, just that they were simpler and expectations for what you as the player could get were far lower. You didn't buy a GBA expecting to play GameCube-style games on it, right? Even with the PSP, while the games were astonishingly close to PS2 quality in many ways, they still felt like the cheaper, much lighter alternative. But once people started expecting console-level experiences on your handheld like the Vita, costs for those games greatly expanded. They ballooned in a way that can make them a different but relatively equal risk to that publisher's major console releases. And unfortunately, there's a line that gets crossed if console development stops syncing with what that handheld can do. Nobody wanted to spend tens of millions with medium-sized teams to make Vita games, so it struggled. And while the Switch's comparatively astronomical sales numbers were too much for many of the greedy execs to overlook, and developers did their best and sometimes even succeeded to an impressive degree, it was always a losing battle. The Switch was marketed as a home console, with home console experiences that you could take handheld. In most of the early marketing, they started with docked play, and then they would take it to their friends or the bus or whatever else for handheld play. And so people expected those home console games. Sure, the adults in the room tempered those expectations and realized they weren't getting AAA PS4 experiences in the palm of their hands, let alone a AAA PS5 experience once the current gen released. But that console quality game mindset still seeped in, and once it does, the cheap and easy ports no longer cut it quite as easy, unless the game was well under spec for every other piece of hardware. Put simply, there is a line where it costs more to downgrade the game from its original target hardware than it's worth risking for whatever sales they might get on Switch. When foundational aspects need reworked from the ground up, you release a half-baked Mortal Kombat 1 disaster, you skip the Switch altogether, along with the PS4 and Xbox One more than likely, or you invest so much money rebuilding that game for that one platform that it has to sell a wealth more than would normally be necessary in order to justify that risk. And in an industry that is this money-obsessed, risk-averse, and punishes the artist and the consumer over and over before it even thinks to reflect on its own shit actions, is it really a surprise when they'll go for the first or second choice before they choose to rebuild a game from the ground up for one console? Mortal Kombat 1 on Switch and all of its manipulations are the fault of Warner Bros. But Mortal Kombat 1 on Switch and its foundational instability are the fault of the Switch hardware itself.